It is my distinct honor to introduce our esteemed speaker for today's lecture, Professor Gerard Robinson. Professor Robinson is a distinguished professor of practice and public policy and law at the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia, with a joint appointment at the UVA School of Law. Professor Robinson's expertise spans a wide array of critical areas, including K through 12 and higher ed, criminal justice reform, race in American institutions, and the role of nonprofit organizations in civil society. His scholarship contributions are extensive, with notable works such as Education for Liberation, The Politics of Promise and Reform Inside and Beyond Americans' Prisons, and essays published in prestigious journals like the University of Virginia Law Review and the University of Pennsylvania Journal of Law and Social Change. A first-generation college graduate, Professor Robinson holds a Master's of Education from Harvard University, a Bachelor's of Arts from Howard University, and an Associate's from El Camino Community College. His journey is a testament to the power of education and dedication. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gerard Robinson. And with that, sir, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. So first of all, let me thank you and your team for the invitation to talk to you about trips that I've made overseas to look at prisons. Let me also thank the UVA alumni, staff, friends, and others who decided to carve out a section of their time today to listen to this presentation. So for me, what did I learn from my visit to prisons in Germany, Brazil, Kenya, and Norway? So let's begin. So how did I get here? Now, this picture was taken this summer in the US, and most of the people you see in that picture have traveled with me beginning May 2023 to the present. And we went to Germany, Norway, and Brazil. There's another picture for the Kenya group. And this is a nice motley crew of people from the United States who are doing many things. We had, in fact, three people who were formerly incarcerated who are on the trip. We have someone who actually worked in a prison who's on the trip. We have people from the Center for American Progress. We have people from Right on Crime and the Pat Nolan Center. And so we have a bipartisan approach to this work. All of us at one point or another were brought together by a guy named Arthur Reiser and his wife, Jessie Reiser. They're both attorneys, they're both veterans, and they're both committed to criminal justice reform. Arthur and I met in my DC days when we were talking about prison reform. He's currently a PhD student at the University of Oxford. He's traveled the world studying correctional officers. And he had an aha moment to say, it's one thing for me to travel, but why can't I bring Americans from all over the country to come and visit with me? And so the group you see are really good people, including the gentleman here, for example, who's a former police officer who later became a member of the Supreme Court for Brazil. We have the president here of Prison Fellowship, the largest nonprofit in the country focused on the role of Christianity in prisons. We've got Mark Howard, who's here, professor at Georgetown University, actually the founder of the Frederick Douglass Project. So we got a good group of people, including our guy from Germany. And in this picture, also this guy over here is a former parole officer. So how did I get to start taking trips? Well, let me talk to you about my journey toward prison reform. So it was mentioned that I'm a graduate of Howard University. When I'm an undergraduate student in DC in the mid to late 1990s, DC is on fire. Crack cocaine is everywhere, drugs, at one point murder capital of the country. Well, in 1989, I happened to meet a young lady who was working with a program called HITS. And HITS is an acronym for High Intensity Training Seminar. And it was created by a forward-thinking Superior Court judge who said, listen, we've got a lot of young men in Washington, D.C. between the ages of 16 and 19 who have one foot on a banana peel, another foot on jail or in jail, and they're going to slip. And the judge said, I've seen the statistics. I'm telling you, if you're committing crimes now, we're going to find yourself in pretty bad shape. So the judge said, tell you what, why don't I put you in what today we would call a diversion program? And I'm going to give you an opportunity to work with college students like Gerard, people who are full-time employees in government or the private sector, military people, formerly incarcerated, others, to basically figure out how can we keep you on the straight and narrow. And so what I thought would be a 2 week volunteer stint ended up being 2 years. And that experience really formed my thoughts about the importance of education, particularly the people who are incarcerated. One big takeaway for me is when I talk to these young guys, again, 16 to 19, mostly African American men, also Hispanic men, most of the Hispanics were El Salvadorian. And I said, what's the one thing you wish you would have had in your life that would have put you on a different path? Now, we could probably give 100 answers. I'm sure all of them are valid. The one thing they all say they wish they would have had was stronger literacy skills. Now, that's interesting. We understand that 70% of the people in America who drop out of high school do so by the 10th grade. Why? Because by the 10th grade, what you didn't learn in reading third, fourth, fifth grade will catch up with you. Not having mastered algebra or mathematical skills will catch you. And so I said, the literacy piece. So I leave Howard University, return back home to LA, and become a fifth grade school teacher. And then a year later, Rodney King riots. My city is up in flames, and I decide one way I can help rebuild Los Angeles as well as my community in LA, but ultimately the nation is through public policy and education. So fast forward to 2015, the picture that's right here is a picture of Freddie Gray. He's killed in Baltimore in 2015. Now, there are two people in this picture you wouldn't expect to see. Former Congress member from Baltimore, Elijah Cummings, who's also a Howard alum, and Newt Gingrich. Well, what do these two have in common? Both of them knew each other in Congress. Well, many people, in fact, are unaware that these two had actually gotten together after this death to figure out what can we do on a bipartisan level to start moving the idea of criminal justice reform forward. And so that conversation led to me meeting a couple of people. And we decided, hey, what can we do to try to bring a bipartisan approach to education reform? That started in 2015. By the time you move to 2018, 2019, you see a piece from the First Step Act signed into Congress, first major federal prison reform effort dating back to 1994 with that crime bill. That did not happen by accident. It didn't happen overnight. It was people from the right, the left, the middle, the north, the south, people of all faith persuasions, other lifestyles who said, can we just wrap our arms around this one issue? And for 1 minute, can we just say, let's focus on this? And so I'm not saying it was easy, but we moved forward, and that's what happened. 2019, I had a chance to co-edit a book with Elizabeth English Smith. Both of us at the time were with the American Enterprise Institute, and that book is called Education for Liberation. The co-authors of The Forward, Newt Gingrich and Van Jones. Now imagine that. I've had a chance to write an op-ed with Van Jones about criminal justice reform. Same thing with the speaker, showing bipartisanship. The last box here is my time in Charlottesville. I arrived here in 2018. And since I've been here, you as alums, staff, friends, administrative staff, and others should be excited to know that your university is doing a lot to address criminal justice reform. One example is Resilience Education, co-founded by two people affiliated with the Darden School of Business. We have, as an organization, awarded over 1,000 certificates to men and women in prison in Virginia with the help of over 700 MBAs from the Darden School. That work is now spilled over into working with Wharton in Pennsylvania, Columbia University in New York, and more works to come. Also excited to say that we now not only have Darden, the law school is now teaching classes inside the prison, and in the not too distant future, we'll have Batten and other schools. So before I talk about the international trip, let's just talk about one-on-one at home. There are approximately 1.9 million people who are incarcerated in the United States. 1 million are in state prisons, 208,000 in federal, about 555,000 are in jail. We have 1,566 state prisons. And as you read through the line, 98 federal prisons, 33,116 local jails, 1,323 juvenile correctional facilities. And since we're talking about Virginia, Virginia incarcerates more juveniles under the age of 18 per capita than any state in the country. That's not something we should cheer about. And yet at the same time, we've had one of the lowest adult incarceration rates in the nation. How does that happen? We have 142 immigration detention centers. Those numbers have changed over time. We also have 80 Indian country jails, something we often overlook. What you don't see on there, we also have military jails for those who are in the military. 2.9 million people are on probation, 798,000 on parole. In terms of race, 42% of people are Black, 36% white, 20% Hispanic, and 3% American Indian, Alaska Native. Now, that number is very deceiving because when you look at the per 100 comparison, many Native American men, Alaska Native men, their numbers are here compared to white or black or Hispanic. And so it's 3%, but they have a high incarceration rate. 93% of people in prison are men, 7% women, but there's been over 800, 585% increase in women going back to the 1970s. Now, if a picture can speak 1,000 words, this picture speaks 1,000,000 plus words. Now, when you look at it, it's a graph. And the graph starts really in the 1950s up to 2016. What you'll notice is that pretty much from 1950 to about 1973, we had fewer than 200,000 people incarcerated across the system. 200,000. And in 1974, and you just see an uptick all the way up to over 2.2 million people in jail. Now, if I were to take that tail and move it to 1925, it wouldn't change a great deal. Or if I moved it to 1825, it wouldn't change. In fact, I can take that tail to 1790 and move it to 1973. For the most part, we've never had more than 200,000 people incarcerated in American history with a couple of blips of like 210,000 until you get to 1973 and moving with 74. Drugs is considered a crime. Drugs, public enemy number one. Nixon makes the whole push about, hey, we have to have a war on crime or war on drugs. Drugs, number one. But it even goes back further to the war on crime pledged by President Lyndon B. Johnson. And then you move through the 80s with President Ronald Reagan getting rid of federal parole, looking at mandatory minimum sentences, crack versus powder cocaine. You get to 1994, the crime bill, and it just goes up. Why is that important? That line or that graph that you see is not natural, it's not organic, and it doesn't have to be that way. It's the invention of public policy at the executive level, the judicial level, and the legislative level. So that's what we're working with. So first trip we take is to Germany. And here I talk about the philosophy of punishment. When people ask what's different, I say, take a look at these two sentences. Human dignity shall be inviolable. To respect and protect it shall be the duty of all state authority. Those two lines come from the Constitution of Germany. That's what opens up the German Constitution. You don't find it buried away in, let's say, Title 18. You won't find it in a working paper that someone wish would happen. No, they say this is important to us. And so the two pictures you see, the one on my left, are pictures of prisoners of war during World War II. We had a chance to go to one of the prison camps in Germany where they had prisoners of war, those who they were fighting against, but also they imprisoned Germans for a host of reasons. Everything from being a homosexual. In fact, Germany has recently addressed that in the last couple of years about what happened then, the whole pink triangle movement, all the way to people who were of different religions and nationalities, naturally, those who were Jews as well. And so they worked in prison camps. And they did a lot of work. Several, I mean, not only several, a lot of people died. Now, if you look to what would be my right, there's a picture, and the gentleman is standing in front of it, but it's a pen of all the concentrate or the prisoner of war camps throughout the country. And so when I talk to people in Germany, even had a chance to go to the Minister of Justice office, why is this important to you? And the one thing they said that's worth sharing is we believe in our DNA that this is important, that human dignity is important. We learned this lesson from two world wars, but more importantly, we're going to codify it in our Constitution. And when people decide to sue, they're suing for a continuation or a betterment of rights they already have. They're not suing necessarily to get something new. And so that's the philosophy of punishment. But I will mention that when I was at the concentration camp, our tour guide said, well, you guys had prisoner of war captives in the United States. I said, yeah. And I remember reading about it in school. But then I returned home, and it was ironic that a scholar, whose book you'll see next, had happened to come to Charlottesville to do a presentation on what? Virginia prisoner of war camps, World War II. Now, much to my shock, I learned that there were actually 17,000 um, prisoners of wars, many of them Nazis, who were in Virginia the late 1940s up to, or the early 1940s up to the end of the war. And what was so interesting about this period is that not only was it in Virginia, but it was in 42 states. And not only did we have 17 here, there were a total of 400,000 people that we fought against who were in the United States, who were in prison of war camps, and at least 375,000 of them were Nazis. Now, why is this important? Because it shows me that at some point in the United States, we also incarcerated other people, but did we treat them the same way that we treated American prisons? And so when I did more research, I found out a few things. Number one, we as Americans have experienced treating incarcerated people humanely. Now, this was driven primarily by United Nations documents that talked about the importance of how you treat people, prisoners of war, when they're in your captive. And so when they were here in Virginia, they were treated well. There was a minimum caloric intake for food daily that was rationed to Germans in Virginia POW camps in ways it was not for Americans who were in Virginia prisons, as well as just Virginians across the board. You know what they also identified funding to pay for facilities to build or to make better in order for them to be more comfortable. Colleges and universities provided education to prisoner of war people free of charge. I even learned out, since we're talking about UVA, the University of Virginia, William and Mary, um, provided free education to prisoners of war, Nazis, in Virginia at the same time of segregation when blacks, of course, couldn't go to the University of Virginia at this time, but more importantly, whites who couldn't afford to go to the University of Virginia. They weren't getting a free education. So it's interesting to go back and take a look and read the newspaper accounts of Virginians saying, wait a minute, didn't we just fight those guys overseas and now they're in our backyard? They're eating better than we are. They're getting a free college education. They even have access to beer because remember, at one point during World War II, there was a beer ration in part because of a wheat ration. And they were like, wait, but there's no ration for the Germans to get beer. POW prisoners of war also worked on prisoner of war sites, but they also worked in communities and they got paid and was able to keep the money. Correctional officers and POWs ate together. So the big takeaway for me and hopefully for you is I will never again allow anyone to tell me that America has no experience treating prisoners humanely. We do. They were Nazis, not our own. That's Germany. So let's go to Brazil. I look at this through the lens of philosophy of faith and family. When we went to Brazilian prison, we were walking through a prison for women, and all of a sudden, you heard a baby cry. Now, some of the people on our trip had never visited a prison with a baby, and so we turn over and we walk and look in, and there's a room with moms and babies, and they're working together. Well, all of a sudden, we had to have a conversation about, well, why do we have children in prison with moms? And there was a debate on, well, you can do three things. You can birth the baby and then give the baby to the family. What about the connection between the mom and the baby between then from a biological standpoint? That's number one. Number two, you can keep the baby in prison and then have the baby um, susceptible to all kinds of challenges that come along with prisons, everything from disease to violence. The third thing is we can say that having a child with the mom is important and back it up with public policy. And so in the Brazilian constitution, moms have a right to actually keep their baby with them while they're in prison. Not the whole time. There are different nuances about how long that can actually take place. But the reason that's important, because when you think about the United States, there are currently 2,000 babies in the United States who are in prison. with their mom. I had a chance to go to Nebraska to visit what is now the second oldest nursery program in the country. And yeah, it's a nursery, and yeah, it's a prison. But in the U.S., you're not going to find the child with the mom no longer than 8, sometimes 18 months. Again, that's driven by federal state law, what judges can do. But the big point is Brazil believes that even when you're incarcerated, we have to find a way of keeping the family together. So that's one picture. The other picture, you're going to see some men in prayer. And this is a picture about it's a picture of one representation, but it really represents a prison I had a chance to visit called APAC. And it was created in the 1970s in part after a prison riot and the death of one of its leaders. This prison has no guards. They actually guard themselves. And so I made the mistake initially of telling one of my children that I was going to go visit a prison with no guards, and she started tearing up. And so I said, "Oh, yeah, let me not say that again." But when all of us arrived to the bus, we got on the bus, we took a long drive into the central part of Brazil. We left Sao Paulo. And when you get there, it's a real prison. But what we figured is, yeah, I get it. It's really a prison for nonviolent men. It's really a prison for people who were just there for maybe drug trafficking, nothing real. Well, when we talked to the leadership, they says, no, there are murderers in here. There are rapists in here. There are also drug smugglers in here. This is a real prison. And to get into APAC, there's a waiting list, but a judge has to actually read, we'll call it an application that you complete to identify if this is the right program for you. So some of us as skeptical Americans said, well, are they really just trying to get into this program because it's less crowded than the traditional prison for men in Brazil, where you can have up to 49 men in one cell? Gangs run a lot of the prisons. Is this a way of getting away from that? Yeah, the leadership said that's some of the reason. But you come here because you want to change yourself from the inside out. Faith is a factor. Now, it is a Christian-based organization, but this year, in fact, they changed it to open up to those who are Muslim, to open up to those of other faith traditions, or people who are agnostic, or people who are deists. The whole idea is faith is a factor. And so we broke bread with those men. We talked to them. They played musical instruments and we talked. Very moving experience. And so when I think of philosophy of family and faith, here are a few things I take away. I learned, basically learned that the Brazilian Constitution and judicial decisions support children staying with families and mothers, something that we can think about here in the U.S. Visited a prison with no guards. There's actually programs in the US going back to the 30s where they tried to experiment with giving men who were in a prison more experience or more opportunities for self-governance. They were mixed results, but just to know that's a piece, and that religious and government institutions support people who are in prison. So let's get to Kenya. Now, my Kenya trip wasn't with the people who you saw in the first picture. It's the people here. The person right here is Judge Ann Williams. She was appointed to the district court in the 1980s by Ronald Reagan. She was appointed to the circuit court by Bill Clinton. She decided after she left the bench, she now works for Jones Day. She has their portfolio for the continent of Africa. And more importantly, she's interested in the rule of law. And when she traveled throughout the continent, she realized two things. Number one, a lot of women who have law degrees or who are judges need the kind of support that she can provide, because in many ways, in the US, we also find in Kenya, a lot of opportunities for men, but you still have that glass ceiling for women. She said, we're going to break that by bringing professors, bringing people from justice defenders, bringing people from law schools to work with women. That's part one. But number two, she realized that approximately 80% of the people in a prison that we visited, it's the prison behind us right now, never had an attorney represent them. They went straight to prison. And she identified that some of the paperwork necessary to help the men and women, some you'll see in orange, some you will see in other colors, they simply needed not just a lawyer always, but a paralegal. And so what the judge did is the people you see sitting mostly in the front row are from the United States. They're part of a national coalition of advocates who travel to Kenya and for almost a week will teach courses to prepare people on how to prepare a brief, how to do research, how to look at a crime scene, to prepare them at one point when they come out to think about going into law. Now, the gentleman sitting right here is the founder of Justice Defenders. He's also a lawyer. He played a role in actually having the University of London have a correspondence program so that some of the men and women you see behind us are currently enrolled in law school in prison. And so this picture was taken. You'll notice that there are a couple of men who are wearing, and one woman here wearing a green uniform. They're correctional officers. Now, I can tell you, no trip to Brazil, to Germany, or to Norway provided me an opportunity to see guards and the incarcerated together. And so that's why I say there's a together moving ahead. Number one, um, learn that incarcerated men and women can earn a law degree online while incarcerated. Men and women can enroll in classes together. I haven't seen that in the United States, along with the correctional officers. I literally saw all of them in the same classroom. I'm like, wait a minute, aren't you guarding this person? Well, I'm by law and profession, I am to guard and watch this person, but right now we're all students together. Very different. And some men and women can actually leave the prison walls and have a job outside. So that's Kenya. So let's go to Norway, Philosophy of Memory. The book that you see right there is co-authored by two people. One is named Nina. You're going to see her on another picture. You're also going to see her co-author in another picture. This is what I would consider the best book out there on prison education in Norway. I have the book. We used it when we were there, and I'll talk more about why that book's important. The gentleman here, his name is Stian. He's a former correctional officer with 20 years of experience in the Norwegian prison. He now works for the Salvation Army. And you want to know why? Because in Norway, the Salvation Army is one nonprofit that works with prisons to serve as a reentry center. We know that in the United States, approximately 635,000 people leave prison every year. That's roughly the size of the city of Memphis. But 75% come back within 5 years. 75%. Technical violations or some, not necessarily always a brand new crime. But some of it is how do we leave prison and who's waiting to wrap their arms around us and help us? And so he plays a role there. Now, I picked this picture more for effect. The US prison, a lot of people in a single cell, there's actually really a jail, where in Norway, everyone has an individual prison. But guess what? I've seen jail or prisons in the US where that's the same. So, philosophy of memory. Now, why does that matter? One of the people that I talked to, I say at the end of the day, people tell me the reason Norway works is because you're a rich country, you have a lot of money, and therefore you can afford to be liberal and progressive about your ideas. And the gentleman laughed. He says, no, no, no. Long before we discovered oil, we were not a very rich country. In fact, we were a relatively modest country. But remember this, the prime ministers who came into power after World War II, along with those who ultimately went to the parliament, most of them had been in Nazi prison camps during the war. And so when they left prison after the war and they have to rebuild and rethink what does crime and punishment and justice look like, they says, I saw injustice. I saw brutality. I saw inhumanity. We're going to be different. And they did it when they weren't rich. They did it when they still had to struggle. So philosophy of memory. Here are a few takeaways just for you. Correctional officers in Norway go to college for 2 years. They study ethics, philosophy, criminal justice, along with all the nuances of being a correctional officer. Um, Normalization, not rehabilitation, is the mission of prison. I said, what's the difference? My guy said, Mr. Robinson, you Americans, ah, rehabilitation makes two assumptions. Number one, that there's something innately wrong with you, and that we have to root out the innate badness in you. To rehabilitate you, that's number one. The assumption is you already weren't rehabilitated or habilitated before. And then number two is we strip you of your name. We put you behind bars, often cut off your opportunity to see family, no conjugal visits, at least in some states, and on and on. Nah, we call it normalization. Your punishment in Norwegian prisons is loss of liberty. You've lost the liberty to freely interact and move throughout society. You won't see your family every day like you did before. You're not making a great income. That's your punishment. But while you're here, we're keeping you in normal life. Most of the men I saw did not wear a prison uniform. Some of them worked outside the prison. We went to a kitchen where there are knives, they cook their own food. And so it's very different. Normalization. Here's the last one. Norway has no death penalty, no life sentence, just 21 years in prison. Now, I'm getting ready to show you a slide that may trigger some of you for a host of reasons, and I want to give you a heads up. But I want to show you 2 or 3 pictures because it's moving us beyond rhetoric and reality. So here's the picture. So the gentleman right here, I had sat next to him before I stood up to take the picture. These are, in fact, this gentleman right here is the co-author of the book with Nina right here. And we were talking. One side of his face is scarred from what? Anders right here in 2011 killed 77 people in Oslo and outside of Oslo at a youth camp. Most of the people he killed were young people, teens, and youth. Well, before he went to kill them, he blew up a bomb in central city Oslo. Well, this gentleman right here was in that building. One side of his face is scarred from the burns and the bomb. And so I said, let me ask you a question. When you wake up every morning and you look in the mirror, what do you see? He says, well, I'll be honest. He says, whenever I have to shave, I see him. When I don't have to shave, I see him. When I walk downtown, I see him. I see him. But if I believe in the principles of normality or normalization, and I believe I do, then I have to live with it every day. Bearing the cross, as King would say, this is what I have to do. Now, the picture of Anders there is a real picture. A couple of years ago, he was up for consideration for parole. Now, I don't speak the language of the Norwegian, but I know what that sign means. He did a Hitler sign in court to the judge and then began to speak. He said, I wish I would have killed more people. I'm not sorry about what happened. And he is actually an idol to many extremists around the world. Now, we as Americans have to ask ourselves a question. If he was in the US, depending upon what state he was in, he would have the death penalty. He would have had an opportunity to do that. Some other places, life, possibly life without parole. But the question is, he's not normalized. What happens? Well, I found out that there's actually a clause that says if the judge identifies that you haven't changed, that the normalization process hasn't worked, they can extend your sentence by 5 years. And so while they don't have life, you could walk your way into a longer sentence than 21 years without changing. But this is real. And that was a tough conversation. In fact, when I was in North Dakota visiting a prison, Nina happened to mention that the day we were there was the anniversary of that killing. And she's a mom of 3. And she got emotional talking about it, just like I would if my kids were there. This is real, but it also gets to the aspect, it's easy to say you want criminal justice reform. It's easy to say you want second chances. But what about when it comes time to the victims and their families? I can tell you that's a tough call. And I can tell you the number of victims who've come up to me and said, wait a minute, let me see if I get this straight. I'm raising my grandchild who was murdered, but you support giving that murderer free housing and access to a free education, college education. But I and my husband or my partner, we're going to have to take out a second loan on our home to pay for my grandson to go to college because this person killed. And you're telling me that's justice? Where's my justice? Where's my fairness? Well, communication science tells us that it takes 7 seconds for you to catch someone with your message. Guess what? I can't catch anyone in 7 seconds or even 7 minutes or even 7 days. I know firsthand, having gone to court with personal and close family members who've been victimized, what it's like. It's not an easy sell. So just understand, I get it when you say, what about the victims? Speaking of Norway, rather than me talk about it from a distance, I've done a couple of things. Since 2018, I've taught a course initially at George Washington University, Trachtenberg School of Public Policy. And beginning in 2018, I began to teach a course at UVA Law School called Education Inside U.S. Prisons. I currently teach the course to undergraduate and Master's of Public Policy students at Batten, as well as first, second, third, and Master of Law students at UVA. Fortunately, Dean Ian Solomon, Dean of Batten, approved me taking 18 students from the University of Virginia, the bulk of them undergrads, not only from Batten, but from arts and sciences, but also graduate students to go visit prisons in Norway, to give them an opportunity to see what I saw, but also to do a few things differently, like visit reentry centers and to go and actually talk to people who are incarcerated, meet with members of government, meet with judges and others. And so this is another way that your alma mater is bridging the gap between theory and practice, research and policy by taking students to see it. From a research perspective, I'm headed to Oxford University June 9th and 11th, 2025 to deliver a paper about the subject I'm sharing with you at a national conference on character and global challenges. There are currently 11 million people on the globe who are incarcerated. That's the highest number in modern times. You actually have approximately 22 million children in the world who have at least one parent who's incarcerated. You're looking at roughly 5 million here in the US, and you've got 19,000 children around the world in prison. And according to some great research by Dr. Bahaya Muhammad, who is a professor of sociology and criminal justice at Howard University, who's traveled the world to look at prisons. When she speaks to my class, says in some countries, if one person commits the crime, the whole family goes to prison. And so I'll be there with a group of scholars, philanthropists, advocates, and others across the globe to talk about this. So here's where I'm going to end. Where do we go from here? The three statements you see are things that I use to guide my philosophy of work about prison reform. I'm not soft on crime. I'm smart about time. 7 out of 10 people who are in prison or who are incarcerated today are there for violence against your body and your property. Even though approximately 1/3 of the people there are incarcerated for nonviolent crimes, the people who had their purse snatched, the people who had drugs sold to them, wasn't a weapon of war used, it wasn't a knife, but they still feel violated and they still feel like it was violence. So I'm clear about this. You do the crime, you do the time, but 95% are going to come out. Let's be smart about time. Number two, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. You just got to be there to have this conversation. Lastly, no matter who's in the White House, we cannot have our work regulated to the outhouse. I said that before the 2024 election. I said that before the 2016 election. I've said that independent of who's in the White House, we should try to find a way to cross party lines, ideological lines, and other lines to open up doors of opportunity. Thank you so much for your time, and I will now turn it over to you to see what questions we have from the audience.
Professor Gerard, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your research. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your travels with us. I feel like I've already traveled to a couple of those places just by hearing about it from that perspective, of course.
Mhm.
But more than anything, I know that our alumni are very enthusiastic about asking questions. We just had one come up discussing certain destigmatization opportunities that we have. The question clearly states what needs to be done to create a counter narrative that destigmatizes those who have been onboarded into the criminal justice system. It goes on to ask how best to illuminate and better address the root causes that lead to incarceration. Is it possible to address these issues upstream if possible?
Great set of questions. So number one, language matters. I don't refer to those people as inmates. I refer to them as incarcerated people. For the same reason, I don't call my ancestors slaves. I call them enslaved Africans. It's to give them a humanity and then say they were enslaved, but they were Africans before. People were people before they were incarcerated and became inmates. And so in class, as I work with the students, we're going, they're not inmates, they're incarcerated. Number two, I also say these The person you see is someone's son, daughter, someone's lover, someone's friend. There's someone's mom or dad. Approximately 52% of the women in prison, 54% of the men in prison in the US are parents. And so there's a whole parent dynamic. Number three is that when we go inside of a prison, I tell students this is not what some people call dark tourism. This isn't a tour. This isn't a zoo. You're not walking in and say, "Ooh, look at him. Ah, look at her," and sit around and take notes. You've entered someone's home. It may be a prison, but that's someone's home, and it may be their home for a very long time. And so that's something I don't want to do. Number two, when they come out, there are times where I'll write about someone having a felony or being a felon as I'm talking about laws and policies and procedures, but I don't like to refer to people as felons or ex-cons. These are formerly incarcerated people. And so one thing is language. The root cause, a lot of different ways you could start. I became a fifth grade school teacher in Los Angeles in part because I wanted to stop the school to prison pipeline early by making sure students had strong, what the young men would say, literacy skills. So that's one thing we can do. Number two is we can partner with police, partner with nonprofit organizations, partner with employers and others to say, what can we do from a partnership perspective to make this work? I think the best partners would include uh, the court system, probation officers, family, community, formerly incarcerated, nonprofit sector, for-profit sector. In terms of the question about destigmatization, one thing that's actually helping in some ways social media, and movies. Now, think about the documentary, The 13th. A lot of people learned a lot about law because of that book. Orange is the New Black. There's another one about a jail where they had an experiment to work. So I think media, while doing some challenging things, have opened up the doors in a way that Scared Straight and didn't do for me in the 1970s when I was a young person. So I think media's happened. And I think fourth, it's doing stuff like this. It's talking to alum who are in positions of authority with their UVA degree or degrees to sit in rooms of power. And when people talk about, can we donate to programs? Hey, here's a program that I know of that we can donate to, or how can I volunteer my time to volunteer? So those are just a few things I recommend that people can do.
Sounds amazing, sir. And then as we go into the next question regarding legislation, how do you approach legislators who appear to want no change in reintegration of former incarcerated persons into society? And then they mention the example of Florida to negate an amendment allowing former incarcerated people to vote.
Yeah. So the lawmaker piece is key because legislation is where this is going to take place. When you saw that major, hockey stick, again, that was because of federal, state, local legislation, again, executive, judicial, and legislative. So one of the things that I did starting with, let's say, 215, is I started going to visit state lawmakers in Georgia, uh, New Jersey, New York, meeting with people here in Virginia, to bring with me research to show that people who participate in correctional education programs, and by correctional education programs, it's four things. It's adult basic education. Let's just say that's grades, pre-K to 8, adult secondary education, that's high school, that's GED work. Vocational and technical education that also can be high school level as well as community college, as well as not college as much as workforce development. And then the fourth is post-secondary education. That's getting a degree, a certificate, or a credential from a four-year institution. So I bring in research to show that people who participated had, according to one research piece for people connected with RAN, 30%, 37% less likelihood to actually return to prison. There's also other research to show community college enrollment or degrees can help. The Vera Institute, for example, who've worked with the Second Chance Pell program for a number of years, great data on degrees earned, what people are doing, and how it's changing the narrative. So the number one is bringing in research. Number two is showing the fiscal reality. There's research to show that for every dollar invested into a correctional education program, there's $4 to $5 return on people, A, not coming back to prison, people being more productive, people paying tax into the system, that kind. Number three is to show what wardens and correctional officers themselves have said. Now, when you were looking at the First Step Act, or when it was time to talk about trying to really push more people toward Pell Grants, there were over, I think, 12 Republican governors who signed a letter saying, this is good for our state. This is good for our community. And then when you had police officers and others said, we support this because it makes prison safer and it makes our community safer. And so when you're getting people from the governor's office to those who have to implement this in prison or those who are doing a street level or bureaucratic work, that kind of stuff matters. Fourth thing that we did was to actually let the incarcerated themselves speak and tell the stories. They're their best advocates. They were the ones who were involved. I haven't been just as involved. I have family members who have, so I don't pretend to have the internal knowledge. But if I can go to a table and open up the door for someone to do so, I will. And at times they'll open up the door for me because I can bring in a skill set and a narrative to be helpful. The fifth thing is to realize that when you have nearly 70 million people in the United States with a criminal record, now, a criminal record alone doesn't mean you're incarcerated, but when 70 million people have a criminal record, you start realizing that independent of race, class, or creed, we're probably five names away from knowing someone who's been impacted by the criminal justice system. So all of those things, to go back to the other question, upstream, are helping people in decision-making authority make decisions. Is everyone always doing the right thing? No, but I can tell you in 2024, we're further than we were on criminal justice reform in 2014, and surely not as draconian as we were in 1994 that led to the 1994 crime bill.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Gerard. Now, this one's about the aspect of punishment. What about the retributive aspect of punishment? What about deterrence? And then they go on to share a little bit about their experiences. I've heard multiple times that punishment doesn't deter people, but I think this runs counter to most people's experiences and what we've been taught. Sure, certain violations probably don't warrant incarceration, and there is a problem of punishing people of color more severely. These issues need to be addressed. They also go on to say one last thing about violent offenses should always receive the harshest of punishments.
When I open up my class on education inside U.S. prisons, one of the things I say is that punishment existed long before prisons and imprisonment. That the idea of punishment is older than the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence. In fact, let's just look at it from a biblical perspective. Cain kills Abel. What was his punishment? He was banished from the Garden of Evil. God said, you're going to be a fugitive, or you're going to be a vagabond or a vagrant amongst the people. And then Cain said, your punishment is too harsh. Now I'm paraphrasing. Your punishment's too harsh. He didn't say your incarceration was too harsh. He said your imprisonment was too harsh. So the idea of punishment precedes that. Even in the aspect of the Abrahamic traditions across the board, you had punishment before you had prisons. So when we're talking about punishment, we can look at retribution, an eye for an eye. We had that before we had the 1994 crime bill. We can look at incapacitation. Now think about it. I call myself a prison reformer. I'm not a prison abolitionist. But you know what? I have two articles on the first day of class written by well-known abolitionists for prison. Why? Because I want my students to understand the ubiquity of the whole idea of the debate. While I'm not an abolitionist, I believe they have a voice at the table. It's an important voice, and they're making me think differently. But when you think about incapacitation, it simply means to remove someone away from society so they're incapacitated to do harm to you, which means incapacitation can take place in prison, yes, but it also can take place in community supervision. It could also take place in a less carceral environment where people are removed. You also have what they call just desserts. And that's kind of like retribution, but you know what? You did the crime, you did the time, and then the severity of the type of crime. You commit murder, then you should have the harshest crime. You steal a wallet, less. And there are all kind of philosophies of punishment that we talk about in class. And so this is something that's ongoing. We're going to have debates about what works or doesn't work. I will say this. There is a debate about whether or not punishment works. I would raise the question, well, how do we define punishment? And in the absence of any punishment, will that be a carrot to say, hey, I want to do more? Or is prison or imprisonment the stick? We won't solve that today. We haven't solved it in over 100 years. But the philosophy of punishment is something that we should think about deeply before we start talking about prisons. Again, the prison is simply a technology to articulate the state's retribution to you, but that existed long before then. In terms of what causes crime, we can say poverty. We can say family structure. We can say environment. There are a lot of reasons. One thing I will say is whatever we identify, try to work that lane and try to solve it. And so I tell my friends, while we're trying to fix poverty and families and the conditions, while we're trying to do all of that, I'm trying to educate the folks that we have so that one day when this presentation is given 100 years from now, the nature of it will be different because we have at least worked on a couple of those.
That's amazing. This one's going to touch on a different country. And so it starts off by saying it seems that the Norwegian penal system works well because the Scandinavian countries have a greater dedication to the societal contract and are ingrained to support one another. For example, the tax rate is 75% for some folks, and education and medical care are free. Do you think a penal system like theirs could work in a country where we are not taught from birth to care as much about our communities and do not feel the responsibility of caring for others? I'll let you touch on that. I have my own thoughts.
Yeah, no, no, great. Again, another great set of questions. So, when I returned from Norway and was sharing with my friends and colleagues what you learned today, they said, Gerard, that's not going to work in the United States. You want to know why? Well, first of all, it's a predominantly white country. And so we are a much more racially diverse country, and therefore it can't work. I said, so you're saying that their culture is different? They said, yeah. I said, well, how do you define culture? Social anthropologists define culture as the transmission of hopes, fears, beliefs, and ideas from one generation to the next. That is culture. If you're saying culture is phenotype determined by race, then that's a different question. I'm saying that when I went to prison in Norway, I saw black people, I saw a lot of white people, I saw others. And so their prisons look like ours in some ways, even though they have a smaller minority population. But more importantly, I'm not focused on the culture of this. I'm in no way saying that race isn't a proxy on how treatment is disproportionate. We all know that. But I'm saying that if we're going to talk about culture in the way defined by social anthropologists, then yes, we can take the culture of normality or normalization. We can take the culture of training for correctional officers, the culture of second chances, and inculcate that into our prison system. In fact, in Pennsylvania, I believe in the prison in Chester, Pennsylvania, there's actually a section there called Little Scandinavia, where the former Secretary of Education traveled to Norway and other places, returned home, and said, I want to implement some of this in the prison. When I was in North Carolina, North Dakota, visiting the prison, but also in actually in Colorado, there were Norwegian aspects of what was seen there instituted at a prison I had a chance to see. There are other places, people who traveled to Norway from different universities across the country who've come back and in their own way are starting to add things. So yes, we can bring theirs to the US. Now, the question is, we live in a country where we aren't taught to care like that. I would take a different approach. I do believe that we are in a country that's taught to care, either from the home you live in, from your faith tradition. If you play a sport, the whole idea of teamship. So I believe we have it, but I also believe we have a stronger idea of punishment. We can have those two exist, but I do believe that we actually can make that work here. The part about the tax rate, that's always a question of money. Even though they have a great prison system, they have a 20% recidivism rate. Even though they have a great education system, they have terrorists who are there who benefited from the tax system, who benefited from free education, who benefited from free everything that comes along with that kind of system. And yet, with all the benefits of financial comfort and access, still committed crimes. Some of them are still drug addicts. We didn't talk about drug addiction and how that leads to prison. I would say Germany is one place to look in terms of unique ways of working with people who are drug addicted or mentally ill in prison. So we can make it work, but like with anything else, it's not money, it's political will. Do we have the political will? And political is just not right, left, Democrat, Republican, everything else. It is really, do we have the tenacity to believe differently? And I believe we do, but it definitely takes leadership.
And then I believe this is going to be the last question. I really appreciated you sharing about the caring of others. I want to go and touch on this last one. In New York, there is consideration of allowing all incarcerated people to go before the parole board at age 55. One aspect that I noticed as you were sharing was this topic of age. And so I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say about in New York, the parole board at the age of 55, as New York has some history, and I'd love to hear what you have to say on that.
So between the ages of 18 to 35 is where you're going to find the bulk of men and women who are incarcerated. But there's a fast growing population of men and women 55 and older who's growing because of the length of their sentences. Now, I can understand why 55. Well, for one thing, the criminogenic likelihood that a 55-year-old is going to commit the same crime he or she created when they were 15 or 25 is pretty slim. So there's an age dynamic of you almost not aging out of criminal activity, but minimizing the probability that you'll return. So that's one reason of saying, hey, let's take a look and see if it's time to let you go. Number two, if you've been in there since your 20s, you're now 25 and you're now 55 years old, there is a track record of what you've done or didn't do while you were incarcerated. Here in Virginia, people who are involved, for example, with Resilience Education Program, who've earned at least one credential, they've used their education when going before a judge or a parole board to say, listen, with my time, I finished high school. With my time, I've earned a certificate. And guess what? The authorities have said, we're going to reduce your sentence, or in some instances, we're going to release you early because you've shown you've done something. So at 55, you've got a record. Not saying everyone's going to do everything well, but also not saying that everyone has access to a great education program. Some do better than others. Third, by the time you're 55 years old, we're also talking about health. Take a look at the rising health costs for prisons. You're caring for people who, while incarcerated, often aren't getting great health care. They often come from communities where they didn't have access to great health care. You leave no good, little great, little good, or let's just say little great health care to little to no health care, and your body's aging and changing with time naturally, whether you were in prison or not. But physically being in the prison and the physical, psychological, spiritual trauma that goes along with being incarcerated and what that does to eat on your body and your brain, your soul, your DNA is tough. And so, how do you take 4 or 5 doctors who are working hard to help people? How do you do that? So, I do think it's time for a place like New York, could be other places, to say, you've reached a certain age, what can we do? But remember that 55-year-old person who killed the son or daughter of the grandparents who are raising the child, they also should have a voice and a say in this. Because when you let that person out at 56 years old, the people left behind, that son or daughter will never get a chance to see their father or dad turn 56 years old. The parents won't see a son or a lover or a friend. And so it's the trade-offs. But just looking at this from the aspect of the likelihood of committing a new crime or returning to that lifestyle, the costs associated with it, looking at a portfolio of change, but also acknowledging you've done your time, you've paid your debt to society. How long is too long? But New York has taken a look at that, and who knows? Again, 100 years from now, when that question is raised, we may say Virginia was also a part of that as well.
Gerard, Thank you so much for your time. I am greatly appreciative of your expertise and your willingness to share through the lens. As our title says, I want to give you the opportunity. Is there any last minute things that you didn't address during your talk? I'd love for you to have the final word for the send off.
University of Virginia is doing great work right now for people who are incarcerated in prisons, but also those who are in our local jail. In fact, we had a professor who taught a course inside the Albemarle Charlottesville jail where he brought students in from UVA undergraduates who sat next to incarcerated people in jail to have a class. It's something I'm thinking about doing in 2025, 2026. Number two, remember, you're in a position of power and authority. Use it to share with other people not only what you learned here, but to also expand your own ideas about criminal justice reform. I accept the fact that we have people on this call who are abolitionists. I'm glad that you're at the table. We have people who want to lock them up, throw away the key. I'm glad you're at the table. Only by being at the table are we going to make sure we're not on the menu. And the third thing is, if I can be of any support to you, if you're looking for someone to talk at a local or statewide alumni event about this work, consider me a scholar or an advocate for you to do that. You can find my information at the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. I also have a web page at the law school, Gerard Robinson, and glad to be of service.